Welcome back, everybody, to the Rule Your Pool podcast. This is episode 25. And in this episode, Jared, thanks for being with me.
I think it's been a minute since I've been on a podcast.
Well, yeah, it's been a while. We had Joe on the last 4 episodes, and he did a great job
I hope so.
we
I do
covered
like Joe.
Well, I like Joe too. Yeah, we covered the 4 pillars. It's good to have you back because this is a 2-part series on green pools. And anytime we talk about green pools, I know that we have to walk a tightrope on what we can and cannot say for various reasons. That's why I wanted you on this episode. So thank you for being with me.
Yes, happy to be the hall monitor here.
Yep. All right. So this is episode 25. Why is my pool green? You might be asking that at home if your pool starts to turn green or if you open it up in the springtime and it's already green. Usually it's when pools have been neglected or they haven't been chlorinated, but there's a lot of other reasons why. It's not always something like algae, and we're going to discuss that. So episode 25, let's get right into it. Let's go. Welcome to Rule Your Pool, the podcast by Orenda that explains and simplifies pool chemistry so that anybody, regardless of experience, can understand it. I'm your host, Eric Knight, bringing clarity to these subjects so that you can bring clarity to your water. If you're ready to rule your pool, then let's go. Jared, I had a call last week from a commercial operator and I think it was 260,000 gallon pool, and they're opening it up for the summertime. This was in Florida, and it's already starting to turn green, but it's not like opaque green, meaning like pea soup where you can't see the bottom. It was perfectly translucent. All right. It was just tinging green. You ever come across that?
Absolutely. Funny is the picture in your background, I believe, is from a customer that sent me the picture of why is my pool green? And the fix was actually really easy.
And that's what we want to discuss. So I'm going to let you take the lead on this, but we know of at least 3 different reasons that pools actually turn green. Okay. One of them, of course, is algae. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that later, but that's the most obvious one. There's 2 that are a lot less obvious. All right. The first one is copper. If you have copper oxidizing, it's going to be tinging green, and it may eventually cause a stain. It'll look kind of like turquoise, bluish, greenish. But it's not, it's going to change the color of your water, but it's not going to change the clarity of your water, if that makes sense. And if you look at the photo behind me, you can clearly see the main drain. You can clearly see the vacuum. And for those of you listening to the podcast, I figured out how to change my background on Zoom. So I've got a side-by-side, same pool 24 hours later. One is very green, one is very blue. And thank you to Jared for sending me those photos because I did not take them.
I was happy to get them because we had heard this many times. People had called us many times, and we told them to fix it by balancing the chemistry. And what do you know? It worked, and we got proof.
Yeah, well, that's what happened with this one. So I asked them, what's your copper? Well, in this case, they didn't have any copper, no copper readings. So if it's not copper and there's no copper in the tap water and they're not using copper algicides, okay, you could probably safely rule out copper, but there is that third reason that pools actually turn green. So Jared, what is your understanding of why the pool behind me was green?
I'll tell you exactly what we did because I'm looking at the text message from the customer as we speak. He sent me a screenshot, or I sent him a screenshot of what his chemical readings were and what I told him to adjust. So just so you know.
Oh, you're a popular guy. That's okay. We're keeping it. We're keeping it live. Don't edit that out.
That was Laura, everybody. Tell Laura, thanks for interrupting the podcast.
Thank you, Laura.
So I'm looking at the screenshot of the chemistry readings. He had a water temperature of 86 degrees, chlorine level of 5, a pH of 7.2, calcium of 90, alkalinity of 110, stabilizer of 35, TDS of about 200, and phosphates of measured 200. Okay.
Now, what jumps out at you on those readings, Jared?
Well, on our app, it says red, your calcium's too low. And the LSI is roughly minus 0.62, extremely aggressive. So looking at all this, you're thinking, okay, it's aggressive water. Usually when you have aggressive low pH water, your chlorine's more efficient. They got a chlorine level of 5. This clearly is not an algae problem, right? Because at a 5 parts chlorine, a 7.2 pH, and a 35 cyanuric acid, he's got pretty clean water. No problems. Well, I told him to increase the calcium to 260 parts and increased the pH to 7.5. That brought his LSI to plus 0.13.
Okay.
Next day, that's the picture next to you.
Blue.
Nice, perfect blue water. All we did was increase the calcium.
You didn't just increase the calcium, you increased the calcium relative to your alkalinity. And now I want to make a disclosure to the listeners out there. We don't know why this happens, but we do know it happens. And I actually reached out because this is not the only instance of green pools just sort of tinging green or turning completely green when otherwise the rest of the chemistry is totally fine. And so we sent this off to the chemist that we consult with, and he said, no, that doesn't make sense. Or at least it shouldn't make sense. That how could the water turn green? But yet it does. So we, in full disclosure, Jared and I, we don't know the exact reasons why, but we absolutely know how to fix it. And it is the strangest thing in the world. But basically, if you have too much alkalinity relative to your calcium, your pool can start to turn green. Isn't that right, Jared?
Green tint. And I had to confirm with this customer. He said, you the man, because he sent me a picture and he said, you the man. I said, awesome, but all you did was increase the calcium, right? And he said, yes.
Yep.
That's it.
That's what this commercial customer did as well that I was talking through over the phone. He couldn't believe it. So he added his calcium. He had, I don't remember the exact numbers. Forgive me. I should have written them down before this episode, but it's our podcast. So I'll do my best. It was low 200s. And I thought, okay, for an outdoor pool, that's usually going to be okay because it's going to be open for the summer. But I said, get that up to 300 because his alkalinity was 120. I'm thinking, okay, he does have more calcium than alkalinity, but that alkalinity is pretty high for a liquid chlorine pool, especially since his water temperature is now, over 75 degrees. It's getting pretty warm. People are ready to swim. So what we found, and I'm going to pull from some research that I've pulled from the past. And there was a doctor, I think his name was Dr. McNamara, who said that the optimal way to inject CO2 into a swimming pool is based on a 4-to-1 ratio. Okay, that's the optimum. So if you're going to use a CO2 injector, you want 4 parts calcium for every 1 part alkalinity. So if you have 100 alkalinity, you need 400 calcium. Okay, so do the math on that. But what we found is if you're under 3-to-1, your water can start to tinge, maybe, but it almost always tinges if it's less than 2-to-1. Is that what you've seen too, Jared?
Well, based on this readings I just gave, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, if you have less calcium than alkalinity, God forbid, like this one, 90 alkalinity, it's going to be really green. Again, we have no idea why it happens, but it seems to be an imbalance. And all that we're teaching people to do is to get that ratio targeted 3-to-1 to 4-to-1, something like that. So what I told him to do is bring that alkalinity down with some acid, dilute it in a bucket with calcium chloride that you're dissolving to get the calcium up and bring the alkalinity down simultaneously. And he said, literally within 10 minutes, and we're talking a large pool here, within 10 minutes, you could watch it start to clear up. You could literally watch the green go away. Again, we don't know why. It's just a really cool thing. But that is one reason that water turns green. And anything you want to add on that?
Yeah, and there's a very distinct appearance here, and this is a clear green, like it's in solution. You got crystal clear water; it just has a green tint,
just like the photo behind me.
Yeah, and the other one here that is the same kind of green tint. It's not like floating moss and just nasty dark green on the walls and covered everywhere, but the water's blue. That would be a metal problem.
Right. Well, just imagine almost like food coloring. It's perfectly clear. The water is perfectly clean looking. It's just green instead of blue. So that's one reason. So the second one that could also be clean, like we mentioned earlier, is copper. And you got to think about the sources of where copper comes from. If it's not in your tap water and you don't have a very old system that has old copper pipes or copper fittings, it's got to be coming from somewhere. And the most common sources of copper, we may do another episode about this in the future, but the most common sources of copper that we see are from aggressive water destroying a heat exchanger. You've seen that plenty of times in your business, Jared, in your service business, and copper algicides. And these sort of things, I mean, sometimes copper ionizers, mineral systems that contain copper over time, but usually that's chelated copper. It takes a while for that to come out of solution, so to speak.
It can though, for sure.
Oh, it can over time.
You get too much copper in there, you shock it or oxidize it, it'll unchelate.
That's true. Algicides tend to do that a lot faster than mineral systems, though, at least in our experience. We don't make any of these products, so I'm not making specific scientific claims on it because I don't understand how long what lasts more than others. But we do know that those are sources of copper that we see very often. And if we can rule out copper, then we can look at the alkalinity and calcium ratio. So here's a good way.
Full disclosure here: we don't recommend the use of really algicides in general. So that's our stance at Orenda. Just
well,
FYI.
that's true. That's true. I think we've made that clear. And by the way, now that I see my own reflection here in Zoom, if you're listening to this, I'm wearing a hat, and I don't do that. I don't wear hats, but this is a flat build Orenda Academy hat, and the only reason I'm wearing is because Jared is wearing his hat from Orenda Academy. The exclusive
such a nice
hat.
snug fit that just curves right around my forehead, and it's just comfortable.
He's got a curved bill. It's like a baseball cap that looks normal, and I look like I'm from California, so I'm not sure. California people, don't be that offended. That's your look, not mine. But that being said, these are actually pretty popular, and the only way you can get an Orenda Academy hat is to pass Orenda Academy and Orenda 4 Pillars. That's our plug. A lot of the questions that we get from homeowners and pool professionals when they call us, they're already answered in these online programs that we've created. So I'm going to take this hat off because I'm just not used to having something on my head. So,
and I'm just going to keep mine on because it's comfortable.
You had to go there.
But okay. Continue on. So we've covered.
That's what I want to say. So if you have a green pool, I'm going to introduce an idea that kind of came to me in a spur of the moment. It's called the white bucket test. Why a white bucket? Is because you need to see the contrast in color. You can't do this with an orange bucket or a blue bucket, but a white bucket, if you take a bucket of green water, and you're going to see a tinge of green in that bucket. Jared, you tracking so far? So what I say to the customers, grab a 5-gallon, 10-gallon, whatever the bucket is. Maybe it's an old chlorine bucket that's clean. And you pull that bucket out and you'll see a tinge of green. Add a few drops of liquid chlorine to it. Now, if liquid chlorine clears it up, and it will happen in a matter of a minute or so. Okay. If you put like 1 ounce of liquid chlorine in there and it clears it up, it was probably algae because it's going to kill the algae and it's going to clear up your water. If that liquid chlorine goes in there and it makes it darker green, Jared, what would that mean?
Metals.
Yep. Copper, maybe some iron, but usually copper. If it turns like a brownish green, iron is probably involved. Yes, because it would be oxidizing metals. So this is a very easy way to tell between those two. If it's neither, and you just put chlorine in and it doesn't really do anything, it's probably the first thing we discussed, which is an imbalance of too much alkalinity relative to your calcium. That has been a very effective way to know why your pool is green. So I call it the white bucket test. Maybe someday I'll write a procedure about it and put it on our site, but that way you can kind of rule out some things versus others. Notice I said liquid chlorine too. Jared, why would I not want to do cal hypo?
Cal hypo, number one, is going to cloud the water.
It's going to turn it white.
Yeah, it's going to be cloudy. They're both going to have an impact on the pH slightly, depending on how much you add, but it's mainly because the turbidity.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So you want to do liquid chlorine, not trichlor, not dichlor, just liquid chlorine is the way to do that test. And it should go well for you there. So we've covered the other two. Now let's get on to the behemoth. The main reason that pools flip green, Jared, what is it?
Algae. Mm-hmm. And, there are a number of reasons why, algae creeps its, existence into our pools, especially right around this time of year. Just, it's May here in Texas. Mm-hmm. But we're coming out of winter and spring. The water's warming up. Things are starting to get moving. We got some rain. We're kind of getting that perfect storm of heat, rain. People are starting to pay attention and use it. Leaves are falling in. People are opening pools right now and getting everything going. So over the wintertime, and as that water warms up, we're creating a perfect environment for algae to thrive. Mm-hmm. Now, combating it, and why did it get there? There's, like I said, many reasons. If you've opened up your pool and it's clean and clear and you're good to go, and then all of a sudden it starts turning green, or you start noticing algae on your walls or your steps, or in the little corners and nooks, most of the time it points to a chemical imbalance, whether it be, chlorine being sucked out of the water too fast, and so it's not no chlorine residual, or the cycle run times on your pool pump isn't running long enough. It's not filtering long enough, so you don't get good circulation, or the filter's dirty, or you can get into an excess of nutrients and chemical imbalance or chemical inefficiencies in your water. which is obviously a huge problem, especially when you open up a pool over the spring and winter.
Well, I just want to interject there that if your water is green for the first two reasons we discussed, the imbalance of alkalinity and calcium or copper, you're not going to see splotches of it on the floor. You're not going to see it in the corners. You're not going to see it on the walls in that way. You might see a copper stain, but copper stains are sort of, well, they're bluish looking. They don't look like clusters of, they're not algae colonies. So you should be able to tell. And if you have those green smears or anything like that, and by the way, algae is not always green. There's mustard algae, and that typically grows in the shady areas of your pool, right?
Yellowish brown.
Yeah, nasty looking stuff, right? And either way, when you have these are algae or plants, basically. They're plant-like organisms. They have cell walls. They reproduce very quickly. I mean, there's thousands of species of algae, and they're all over nature. They're used in energy products. I've seen one in an Exxon Mobil ad where they're using it to detoxify water. So algae in itself is not a bad thing. It's a waterborne plant, basically, and it's going to consume carbon. That's the name of the game in the ecological way of life nowadays, I guess. But the type that survives in a chlorinated swimming pool, that stuff has evolved over time to be pretty hardy and very chlorine resistant. So if you touch it, it feels slimy. It's usually got some sort of protective layer over it that is harder for chlorine to get through. If you touch mustard algae, it's also going to feel really gross and slimy. So one physical thing you could do to help against algae, and we're going to talk in the next episode 26 about how to fix a green pool if your pool flips to green, but brush a lot. If you start to see it, you need to brush and you need to check your chemistry. Jared, what else do they need to do?
I mean, there's obviously different levels of severity of green pools. I mean, what I'm talking about here, I'm talking about the slight green on the walls and the steps, and that's easy to kind of catch up from, if you want to call it that. And like you said, brushing it, getting your chemicals balanced, getting your chemicals more efficient, things like that. That's an easy fix. Checking your programming, make sure you're running it long enough. Not a problem. And then you get the start walls and steps, and then you kind of neglect it a little more, and then it starts creeping into being suspended in your water, right? Mm-hmm. And that's when you get this kind of greenish tint water, and then it just gets darker and darker and darker the longer you let it go. Mm-hmm. So obviously, if you got a pool that's been neglected for weeks, months, some pools even years.
Oh, I've been to them where the home was, evicted, or they sold it and went to another state, and then something happened. Nobody, took care of the pool. Yeah. I mean, it could absolutely flip green.
So the level of severity here is a wide range, but the phenomenon on why it's green and why algae's there is still the same. You got an imbalance of, a lot of algae. You start with a little and it just exponentially grows and gets, spreads more and more and more because there's no chlorine or no chemicals to counteract it. And then all of a sudden you let it go for a month and it's game over. I mean, you got a swamp basically.
Well, these species of algae, and again, there are a lot of them. So we say the main two, of course, are green algae and yellow algae. There's also what people call black algae, which look like little black spots that are tap rooted into the surface. That's technically a cyanobacteria, not technically algae, but it's treated pretty much the same way. If you have this, chances are your water is at a threshold where the growth rate of this algae is faster than the killing rate of your chlorine. That's when you have an outbreak. And we've discussed that in pillar number 3. I think that was episode 23, and in earlier episodes as well, because that's really the name of the game in sanitization. It's, can your chlorine keep up with the reproduction rate of living things? In this case, algae is the main one. So you will consume a lot of chlorine trying to kill multiple generations of algae if you don't take care of the nutrients that feed them. But more so, you change the conditions of the water. It's not just nutrients. It needs sunlight. It needs warm water. It needs carbon dioxide. It needs all of these things. There's one way that we can, well, I guess I shouldn't say one way. There's a lot of ways. We can't really change the temperature, right? In the summertime, you want warm water, so you don't want to just tank your temperature. That would be ridiculous. You can't really change the hours that the sun comes out. right? So there's some things that you have to take into account. What you can control is your cyanuric acid and your free chlorine levels. That's what you can control. You can control phosphate levels, although that's an indirect relationship. That is not going to, I want to be very clear, it's not going to kill algae managing your phosphates. What really matters here is your free chlorine and your cyanuric acid, because that is the killing speed of your chlorine. Would you agree with that, Jared?
Absolutely. Yeah. Once you get, and that's why we take a totality here of all of our chemicals and all of our chemistry readings, and saying one thing is going to fix this problem. We would never do that. So it's absolutely make sure your pH is in range. And I know we've touched on that a little bit too. It doesn't have to be 7.2, but you don't want it to be 8.5 or whatever either. So you want your free chlorine levels to be in good ranges, your cyanuric acid levels to be within range, roughly, 30 parts, give or take. That's plenty of protection from sunlight and still having good efficiency out of the chlorine. Right. And keeping these things balanced.
One other thing that you can do is, especially in the summertime, because here again, water temperature matters. If it's really cold water, if it's like 50 degrees, algae ain't growing in 50-degree water, not Fahrenheit. I can't even imagine 50-degree Celsius. That would be boiling pretty much. Well, super hot for us anyway, but 50-degree Fahrenheit water is cold. And so you don't really have to worry about algae in the wintertime. You have other LSI considerations to take into account. But when you are trying to stay ahead of an algae incident or an outbreak, what you can do is you can think, at what point do I have the perfect storm so that algae can take over my pool? And this is a condition when you have enough nutrients, the temperature is just right, enough sunlight, not enough chlorine, and you get a condition called eutrophication. And we'll put that in the comments below. It's spelled with an EU at the front, but eutrophication is actually a term that's used in nature to discuss when a body of water, like a pond or a lake, becomes so saturated with nutrients and other conditions that algae can grow and outgrow other forms of life, and it disrupts the ecosystem. A perfect example of this is if you've ever seen a stale, stagnant pond that's just completely overgrown with algae and it almost looks like moss on the surface. Well, that's taking all the sunlight and it killed all the seaweed at the bottom. It's going to choke out other forms of life. It'll eventually kill fish as well. So if you can't get enough sunlight into the pool, or sorry, into the pond in that instance, it's going to disrupt the ecosystem. That is eutrophication. Well, in a swimming pool, eutrophication is basically when you have enough conditions that algae can outpace your chlorine. And that's when you get an outbreak. Now, eventually it's going to flip. As Jared said, it's somewhat exponential because the colony is doubling its size. And given the right conditions, according to some of the sources, and we didn't do the research ourselves, we just read what other people said in textbooks and stuff, every 3 to 6 hours, your algae can actually reproduce. So it can double itself every 3 to 6 hours. And we're going to discuss this in length in the next episode 26 about how to fix a green pool, because in a matter of a week or two, that algae bloom can take over your pool if you're not staying ahead of it, if you're not brushing and you're not chlorinating, because it will grow and it'll grow and it'll grow and it'll grow. And pretty soon, everything's green. Your pH is through the roof because it consumes CO2. Go ahead.
Well, and that's what happens. The perfect environment is like now, where pools are opening up, things are warming up. People have their systems programmed differently to run throughout the winter time. So they either lower their run times or they slow the RPMs or they close them all together. And as they start getting into the higher temperatures and the water starts warming up, they don't take that into consideration. So it just takes, like I said, like you're saying, a couple of days of neglect or having a chlorine level of 0 and having stuff falling in your pool during this time. And then algae spores start to grow. And then it's just a reproduction cycle happens and it just spreads and spreads and spreads. And what we find is once that it starts growing, you are behind the 8 ball. You're playing catch up, and it does not take a long time for it to get out of control. And then it's one of those things where you just feel like you're constantly fighting it, week after week after week at that point, until eventually you will get under control. Right. But it's a headache getting there. So it's taking these things into consideration with make sure your programming's right. You're running your pump long enough that you have the high enough RPM so your filter can do the work. You can get equal circulation throughout your pool, and chemicals.
And that you clean your filter periodically.
Clean the filters, absolutely. All of this is key to keeping a pool clean, clear, and efficient.
And you're also going to know if you're doing these responsible things that Jared just mentioned. And if you want to hear it again, just tap rewind and go back about 30 seconds, because that's all really good information. If you do all those things, you can actually kind of rule out algae if your pool starts to turn green, because you'll know. I mean, if your water is tinging green and you never saw an algae outbreak and your levels are right, it's probably one of the other two things, right? And there's a distinct look that is different with what this water looks like. But I want to wrap up this episode with two other conversations. Jared, you used to have a CO2 feeder on your pool. In fact, I think you still have it, but you don't use it as often, correct?
I don't use it at all anymore because it was a very good learning experience, because I felt that I was battling algae a lot in the middle of summer, more than I was in any other time. And it was when I was pumping a lot of CO2 in the water.
So let's expand on that. Why do you think that happened?
Well, I mean, knowing what we know, obviously, that algae need sunlight, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, phosphorus, all these other things, to help it thrive. But pumping more carbon dioxide into the water created a perfect environment for reproduction. And
it introduced more carbonates into the water. It lowered your pH, but it actually introduced more carbonates into your water. So you actually had more CO2, even though CO2 itself will gas out, it'll convert into carbonic acid, which will eventually come back up into bicarbonate alkalinity. So you're going to have more carbonates in your water. Over time, that adds up. So CO2 feeders, especially on an outdoor pool, can fuel algae growth over time, but not, it's not directly fueling them, so to speak, but you absolutely noticed it in your pool. Now, I'm not knocking CO2 feeders. In fact, I think they're the best solution by far for a commercial pool. And in some cases, residential pools, as long as you're managing it, because your alkalinity is going to go up on a CO2 feeder because of the extra hydroxides from your chlorine. We just actually published an article about that on the Orenda blog.orendatech.com. And you can read it right there. But that's the other thing. If you have too much alkalinity, that's a sign that you have too much carbonates in your water. So you can actually lower your pH ceiling by reducing your total alkalinity, technically reducing your carbon alkalinity. But the lower that carbon alkalinity is to a point, you can limit the ability of algae to grow. Now, that has nothing to do with a product. That's simply the amount of carbonates in your water. If you have less carbonates available, that's going to be a good thing. That's going to help you keep your pH lower, but it's also going to be less, exactly what Jared was just saying, less CO2 available for algae to consume. So that's another thing that you can do. There's one other thing that I didn't write on the show notes, but it just hit my head, and that's potassium monopersulfate, non-chlorine shock. Jared, you've used it before. Every pool owner probably has. Potassium is another nutrient that algae really likes. It's not necessarily essential, although different sources vary on that. Some sources say it is, some sources say it's not. But algae likes it. So if you have potassium in your water that you're introducing through shocking regularly, that could be part of your problem. Now, I'm not knocking the product, but it's not meant to be used every week.
It's a wicked oxidizer.
It is. Well, it is an oxidizer, but it's not a sanitizer.
Yeah.
So
it works really well for what it's supposed to do.
For what it's supposed to do, yes, but it's not an every week sort of thing. So just keep that in mind. Your pool could be, in summary, your pool could be turning green for 3 reasons. Now I'm going to test your memory, Jared. What are those 3 reasons?
Copper, calcium or alkalinity levels being imbalanced,
right? And
algae.
Bingo, nailed it. If you have any questions about why your pool might be turning green, feel free to reach out to us. Our website is orendatech.com. You can reach out to us on Facebook. We are very responsive, and feel free to download our app. It's just called Orenda, and contact us through there. If you want training, we're here for you. Thank you so much for listening. This has been episode 25 of the Rule Your Pool podcast. In the next episode, we're going to cover how to fix a green pool. Stay tuned with us, everybody. Thanks, Jared.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Rule Your Pool, a podcast by Orenda Technologies. For more information on what we discussed in this week's episode, check the links in the description or visit www.orendatech.com.
I hope you find this show valuable enough that you tap that subscribe button and share it with your friends. You can also like us on Facebook and social media. And with our help, you'll be able to rule your pool without over-treating it with chemicals and wasting money. I'll see you next episode.